Hello and welcome to Press TV News Analysis. I'm Kaveh Taqwai. The revelation of British TV personality Jimmy Savile to be a long-term sexual abuser for decades opens the door to sexual abuse involving British personalities and even politicians. The detective that first reported on this, Mark Williams-Thomas, has said that Savile engineered his programs within the BBC and Radio Luxembourg in order to gain access to children. Savile's nephew, Guy Marston, says people like grandfather will never been caught because they are so powerful and so big. Well, in this news analysis, we look at the BBC's role in this affair, their cover-up, not to mention by the British police, and just maybe some other revelations which could be made by our guests in this edition of the Press TV News Analysis.
A recent report by the British police reveals shocking details about the extent of Jimmy Savile's abuses. The report says the cigar champion entertainer physically abused hundreds of people between 1955 and 2009. There are more than 30 reports of rape among the allegations. Of his victims, the youngest of them being 8 years old, 73% were under 18 and 82% were female. Savile allegedly abused victims at nearly 60 medical establishments, including mental care facilities and a hospice, as well as more than a dozen schools and over 30 television or radio studios, among them the BBC.
This report took 10 weeks to compile. This is the report that's come out by the police and the leading children's charity in the UK, the NSPCC. 214 crimes they're now being called. They were called allegations up until now, across 28 different police forces. The first thing to note is those are just 214 crimes coming out of the 600 people that came forward. The police are saying that there could be many more victims who simply haven't come forward and spoken to the police.
The BBC presenter, who died in 2011, became famous as a pioneering DJ in the 1960s before becoming a regular fixture on television, hosting primetime pop and children's shows until the 1990s. He also ran about 200 marathons for charity, raising tens of millions of pounds for hospitals, leading some to give him keys to rooms where victims now allege they were abused. Savile, one of the BBC's biggest stars of the 1970s and 80s, received a knighthood from Queen Elizabeth for his charity work. He was also honored by the late Pope John Paul II, who made him a papal knight in 1990. When he had died. Allegations against Savile did not surface until after his death in 2011. His nephew, Guy Marston, says his grandfather's crimes could never have come out while Savile was alive. The reason? He was such a powerful person. Marston says people like Savile will never be caught because they're so powerful and so big. A documentary broadcast by BBC's rival ITV last year pulled the mask away, claiming that Savile was a serial sex offender who traded on his celebrity to prey on vulnerable children. Since then, the BBC has come under fire, being accused of covering up the scandal, which led to the resignation of the publicly funded broadcaster's Director General less than 2 months into his job. A lengthy report last month said the British broadcaster had missed numerous warnings and proved incapable of dealing with the scandal when it finally broke. A parallel report drawn up by a senior prosecutor faults British officials for not pursuing allegations against Savile more vigorously. This report notes that several women had spoken to police regarding Savile between 2007 and 2008, but no charges were brought. It says the British police could have tried harder to get them to speak out, noting in particular that the women weren't told that other victims had corroborated their accounts.
There's three key areas that we need to look at. The failings of the police that have been highlighted by this report, failings by the NHS. Much of this abuse took place in NHS hospitals and, of course, the BBC. And we saw there that the earliest account coming out of the BBC was 1955, if I wasn't mistaken. But the big rhetoric and narrative that's been coming out over the last few months, that this was something that was happening in the 1970s and it was just a problem of the time, has now been blown out the window by the fact that on BBC BBC premises on the last ever Top of the Pops show, which is a music show. It's a lot closer to modern day than has been indicated.
With the celebrity status Savile gained in the British media, he managed to get away with his alleged crimes during his lifetime. But the shocking revelations raised the alarm as to how far power and fame can get the likes of Savile in a country like Britain.
Well, so many different facets to this case. We're going to try to get more, and of course, opinions of our guests. Let me introduce them. We have Dr. John Bird from NAPAC, that's from the National Association for People Abused in Childhood, who joins us from London. From Foreign Policy in Focus, Ian Williams, who joins us from New York. We have political commentator and filmmaker Sukant Chandan, who joins us from London. Gentlemen, welcome. To set the stage, I'm going to start with you, Sukant Chandan. Have we seen or heard the last of what has occurred here? Given your familiarity with the case, can you set the stage as to what we're looking at overall in terms of this Jimmy Savile case?
Good evening, brother. Sure, I can. First of all, I'd like to really impress upon our viewers that the piece that's just been leading into this and what Sister Nargis has said is no exaggeration whatsoever. The lead-in and Sister Nargis has actually just very factually conveyed what this report has really found. Now, just to give a bit of context in terms of what's been going on in the mainstream British media recently, there was the case tragically, really tragically, of a 6-year-old boy who was beaten to death by his mother, who happened to be Muslim. Now, the mainstream media and, shamefully, the British Asian network radio station, including people like Bobby Friction and Ni Hao, who's a part of that, have been purporting that this has something to do with Quranic teaching as Islam. It's absolutely nonsense. It's obviously to do with this woman had some serious mental health issues. And also we've been seeing in the mainstream media in Britain the absolutely colonial arrogance in the way that they've been reporting the anti-female violence, which is obviously epidemic throughout India, but giving the impression that the British have any right to dictate to our South Asian people. They do not. And our Indian people are very well capable of dealing with this situation, and they are. So really, if they can accuse Indians in such a colonial manner, and if they can accuse our Muslim community in such an Islamophobic manner, then what does this point to itself? It's such a disgusting thing that's occurred for 5 decades long. And as I'm saying, this is not some kind of hyperbole by myself or Press TV. This is the facts produced by this official inquiry itself. But these are the questions that have to be asked. If only celebrities have been celebrities that have collaborated allegedly and most probably with Jimmy Savile. But what about Jimmy Savile's very high-profile contacts and very intimate friendships? We're talking about the royal family. We're talking about Princess Diana. We're talking about Prince Charles. We're talking about senior government right the way up to the top of the government. We're talking about his friendship, his close friendships with senior police. Police have not been touched. Government has not been touched. Senior NHS have not been touched. If we see the example and the model of what happened with the Macpherson report at the end of the 90s, which pointed to institutional racism, that's institutional white supremacy within the British police force for their failings of investigating the murder of our young brother Stephen Lawrence in the mid-90s, then what does this point to? This point, on the model of that inquiry, this points to institutional child abuse. I'm talking about institutional paedophilia with collaboration between the absolute institutions of the British state. Now, why hasn't this come out on the report? Because unlike the Macpherson report, unlike the Stephen Lawrence campaign, there is no mass movement. There is no pressure from the British public. Where are the English public? Are not hundreds and hundreds of our children good enough for us to take to the streets and put pressure on our government to come out with at least some of the truth? I'm going to discuss more of this later, but this is the situation that we're
Since you brought up some
with.
really good questions there, Sukant Chandan, Ian Williams, you can take your pick. But first of all, what is going to do about the public trust in the police? But more importantly, is this related to what an established web-based essayist and print author has said, that perhaps this is a powerful pedophile network that may have links to a former prime minister, number 10, and Parliament?
Well, I'm not quite sure how deep we can go into a paedophile network, but it really brings out the question of impunity. And the problem is that children aren't listened to. That goes right back to Oliver Twist in The Orphanage in Charles Dickens. We don't take children seriously. Their accusations will be discounted. What they say will be discounted, especially when taken with someone who is, presents such a humane and charitable face to the world and is so politically well connected. But the fact there was so much evidence about and that nobody picked up and acted on this is what's really disturbing. And the fact that very few, I mean, the heads that rolled on this, the BBC head, nothing to do with it in a way. It's all of the people in the past who have tolerated this, have covered up for him because he's famous, not believed the accusations of children in comparison with him. He's not the only one, remember. There's similar accusations made about the former Liberal MP for Rochdale, Cyril Smith, which were brought up in the newspapers and were discounted because his friends in the Department of Public Prosecutions and in Parliament and politics actually sort of sat on them and killed them. The real problem here is impunity. And we have to work on some mechanism that children are listened to and their concerns are investigated. As it is, most children think that they will be punished if they bring accusations like this against people in authority. And I hate to say, but it's probably true, they will be punished. We have to make sure that they can make these accusations, they can provide evidence, and that the evidence is looked at and listened to seriously. Well, but on the other hand, we shouldn't go the other way, because if you look in America, there have been witch hunts where there's a kindergarten where 4-year-olds were coached to come out with the most outrageous accusations that couldn't have happened, talking about assaults in a basement in a building that didn't have a basement. And yet, because children were involved, the jury was just railroaded into finding them guilty. So there are two sides to this, but the most important side is children should be protected, and their concerns and their complaints should be taken very, very seriously, regardless of whom they're making the accusations about.
Well, Dr. Bird, you know, the role of the BBC is highlighted in this case, given the fact that obviously some of these did take place there. Many of the abused children were now adults have claimed that they were actually abused and molested by Savile and other BBC celebrities on BBC premises. And BBC is a public, obviously, institution. It's funded by taxpayer money. How do you, what is your impression of what has occurred and, of course, BBC's role in this case?
Well, we've been watching this develop over the past 3 months since the documentary went out, which was put together by ITV, the private sector network. And we've been inundated with calls from people who were abused, not only by Savile, but by people people around Savile, but also people who were just abused during the 1970s, and so are quite elderly now, some of them in their 80s, but also 70s and 60s, all over the country by many different people, and they were not believed at the time. So it goes far, far wider than this. And there's a huge amount of anger that amongst people who have struggled to cope with this, that the focus is on celebrity, when we know for a fact that the vast majority of abuse against children is perpetrated by people known to the family. But all that aside, I think to answer your question about the BBC, yes, it's about powerful men. And it is usually men, not always, but in this case, obviously, Jimmy Savile was a very powerful man, and he was able to intimidate those people who wanted to speak about it. And we've heard various BBC employees talk about it since, that they wanted to do something, but they were scared of Savile. Savile was an ex-wrestler, he was an ex-coal miner, he was a strong man, he had links to gangs, to the illegal underground. And he was very threatening. So I think that explains an awful lot of why perhaps allegations against him were not made in the 70s and the 80s. I hope, and I do actually believe, that the BBC now would take such allegations against a senior broadcaster much more seriously. But they still have a lot to answer for the mistakes that were made, the very, very serious mistakes that were made in the past. If they'd acted on it back in the 1970s, thousands, and it is thousands, not just the hundreds that the police talk about, thousands of children that he raped would not have been raped.
Sukan Shandan, I know you have a lot to say, but please do us a favor here and tell us what BBC has done here, because we're looking at a man, and I'm sorry if some of this may offend you, but preying on mentally and physically disabled children at hospitals, one assault on a patient believed to be brain damaged, reports of gang rapes of children, dungeons, reports of them containing bones to be discovered, boat trips containing children where rich and influential people would rape them. Now, these have to be obviously be approved in some cases, but we have the BBC who had this man have actions occurring on their premises. What does that say about editorial judgment? Expand more for us on that, Sukhan Shandan, if you can.
Brother Kaveh, what more can I really add to what you've said? I mean, it's so debased, it's so depraved. It's an issue that this is a cultural issue, and that's even been admitted in the mainstream. This is a cultural problem, a mainstream cultural problem.
Well, I'm sorry, what is cultural about some of these? If some of these things are true...
No. I mean, there's a culture of impunity. That's what I mean. I don't mean it somehow as British cultural, so you've misunderstood me. So you don't need to be so defensive and jump in. Okay, thank you, sir. So this is what's going on. But what more can I add? I mean, it's so disgusting. I mean, you know, it disturbs one's mind to even think about what's going on. But again, I point to the model of the Lawrence inquiry. But let's point to another model for some comparison. In Belgium in the mid-90s, not the same but similar issue came with Marc Dutroux, who was a child abuser, who senior members of the Belgian government were actually complicit with him in the abuse of children. As a result, this movement of the white, it was just called, it doesn't mean the white people, but it was called the White Movement in Belgium. They had a demonstration in 1996 of 300,000 people in Brussels. We're talking about a very small country of 10 million people in Belgium, and Belgians are not known to be very politically radical at all, and I'm being very diplomatic with my words. Now, if you compare that with this island, Britain, which has around 60, 70 million people, the equivalent of such a mass protest would be something like 2 million people on the streets of London. So where are those 2 million people? And that's when I bring it back to the model of the Lawrence campaign, where the very brave parents and brother of Stephen Lawrence, along with Imran Khan's solicitor and the coordinator, Mr. Suresh Grover, especially the parents of Stephen Lawrence, were brave enough to actually launch a public campaign. And this is really what we need. We really need some of these victims to, and I know it's an inordinate amount to ask victims of this type, but they really need to come into the public and campaign, because the only way anything more is going to come out is through mass public pressure. And because these people are covering from themselves for each other, that's totally clear. This is so prevalent. This is so widespread. This child abuse by Jimmy Savile and his cohorts, that it's clear everyone is covering for everyone. So really, I call upon the English people to really take to the streets, and also to the rest of the world. This is what Britain has to offer you from the BBC, the NHS, and the police and the government. Don't think at all the West, and particularly Britain, has anything sparkly or anything to your benefit. The people of Latin America, Africa, and Asia who are watching, this is the nature of British society, and this is the way that all the senior institutions of Britain are covering up for each other. Recognize the reality for what it is, my dear peoples.
Ian Williams, Sukhan Shandan does have a point. Do you agree with him, though, that this actually is overlapping other areas in terms of cover-ups, etc.?
Well, look, it's not just Britain. Almost every country in the world has structures of power whose members look after each other, who protect each other. It's in the nature of power. It's in the nature of democracies that we should try very hard to make sure that they don't have that impunity, that people are accessible, that complaints are dealt with, and it's quite right that if that involves taking to the streets to do so, then we should do so. But it's not just a peculiarly British problem. What is peculiar in Britain is that we do have this caste and class structure where people of a certain background will look after each other. It's more accentuated than in many other countries. But the right accent, the right public school, the right college at Oxbridge, or the right Freemasons Lodge will all get you protection. And as I said, it's similar in many other places, but in Britain it is a culture that's developed in this cosy way. Just look at the current Conservative cabinet, where almost all of them are people who we thought were social dinosaurs 20 years ago. They're all back and braying in position, and they will look after each other, as they are doing.
Dr. Bird, given the fact that you're from the National Association for People Abused in Childhood, what steps would you take if the situation was under your command in terms of going into this and having the different institutions that are involved here, either through their negligence, through them not following through? What would you do?
Well, that's a very kind offer. If I was in command, things would be run very, very differently. I think first and foremost, the point's already been made that we need to listen to what children say. Unfortunately, children are very often prevented from saying what's happened to them. Jimmy Savile was a very, very clever man at manipulating children's psychology and to put a fear into them that there would be consequences against them. And many perpetrators of abuse against children do that. So that's number one. We have to listen to the children. I suppose then we have to enable the police to have the resources to make very thorough investigations so that strong evidence can be presented in court, as could have been done against Mr. Savile while he was still alive. And I suppose thereafter there needs to be an awful lot of support put in place for the people who have been subjected to these horrific crimes, because the consequences last long into adulthood. Some people may not be too badly affected by it, but others have appalling mental health problems and depression and drug and alcohol problems or self-harming problems, a very negative self-image that is imposed upon them by people who perpetrate these horrific crimes against children. So there needs to be a major commitment across the whole of society. Number one, to child protection, so it doesn't happen in the first place. Number two, to empower the police to investigate thoroughly, present strong evidence, and to get the perpetrators convicted. And I think third, and perhaps, you know, from my point of view, because it happened to me when I was a child in the 1960s and 1970s, I struggled in my late teens and early 20s with hard drugs. I'm lucky to be alive. I'm now in a position where I can reach out and support others. But I had to work on my own to do that with no support from the government.
And Sukan Shandan, you talk about how people should come out. People should come out and protest. But really, is that going to be effective? I mean, shouldn't we get some of these institutions involved in order for there to be some prosecutions? It's not right for people to have suffered in the hundreds, let alone the cover-ups that are involved here, let alone, of course, the state-owned BBC being involved, etc. What else, how do you foresee this moving forward if it was up to you? How would you move forward with this?
Well, we've already heard the gentleman from New York explain himself very clearly. It's an all boys network. But listen, there's so many other issues that are taboo and never discussed that pertains to the sexual, deterioration health of our young people. We have a social phenomenon emerging of basically sexual abuse of many young women who go through an initiation process in joining street gangs in their localities. We have a very unhealthy sexualization of childhood in Britain. We have hardcore pornography, which has become normalized and which is the primary source of it's not sex education, but what passes as sex education for our young people. So really, there's so many problems that are never discussed, no one is addressing, and really I call upon the young people of this country, get over your schisms, get over the disunity, get over the divide and rule tactics of the powers that be, because really the onus is on you to take this situation in hand. And I guarantee you what's happening with the Leveson scandal in terms of the police and the media corruption, with this new scandal that's coming out, if we don't have a social protest movement dealing with this, you know what's going to happen? It's going to blow up again, much bigger than August 2011 in the so-called riots, which I call the uprising of the black and poor. It's going to blow up even bigger, and it's going to make August 2011 look like child's play. And then can we blame young people for coming out like that? I'm not sure that we can.
Very well. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much. Let me thank our guest, National Association for People Abused in Childhood, Dr. John Bird, talked to us from London. From Foreign Policy and Focus, Ian Williams talked to us from New York. And thank you very much, political commentator and filmmaker Sukan Shandan from London. And thank you for watching another edition of the Press TV News Analysis. From Icke and the entire team in the capital, Tehran, it's goodbye.